Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about the concept of joint works under the Copyright Act. In other words, how do we think about works with more than one author, and how to determine whether or not a work has more than one author? In other words, when lots of people contribute or more than one person contributes to the creation of a work, how do we determine, for the purpose of copyright ownership, who gets to claim copyright ownership of the work as a whole? So, as is so often the case, the text of the Copyright Act is pretty clear, right? The authors of a joint work are co-owners, and a joint work is just any work prepared by two or more people with the intention to create a work together. Okay, so seems simple, except for the fact that very frequently people don't agree about these circumstances, and it's hard to say who counts as someone who's contributed something sufficient to count as an author for the purpose of copyright ownership. So we kind of got to look to the facts of particular circumstances in order to figure out how we think about this particular problem. Okay. So really notable case, Childress v. Taylor. What happened here? Well, we've got two separate parties disputing ownership of a work based on the life of Moms Madley, famous Black comedian. Worked for many, many years, extremely popular, recorded a bunch of albums, movies, etc., etc. Alice Childress was a successful playwright, had written a bunch of plays, and Clarice Taylor was a very successful actress who appeared in The Cosby Show, was a lead in The Cosby Show, among many other things. Very successful, very popular stage, theater, and film actress who was very interested in Moms Madley and wanted to produce a play based on Moms Madley that she would then appear in as the titular character. Okay, so Taylor approaches Childress and says, "Hey, I'd like to hire you to work on producing this play for me." It's kind of back and forth. Childress isn't thrilled about it at first, but eventually agrees to be involved, and they work together on the project. Childress doing the bulk of the writing, and Taylor contributing a bunch of information, right, based on her own research and experience and conversations, et cetera, et cetera. So in the course of the project, Childress eventually comes up with a play, which they end up presenting as an initial production. And Taylor wants to continue with the production of the play, but they have a dispute about authorship, right? So Taylor wants to be treated as a co-author. Childress doesn't want to treat her as a co-author, and they have a falling out. So Taylor goes to a third party, Caldwell, and says, "Hey, I want you to take the same material and write me up a new play that we can produce separately." And he does, right? He produces another play, which ultimately gets a broader and more successful production. And Childress brings there's a dispute between the parties about who is actually the copyright owner of the play in question. Childress claiming that she's the owner of the copyright because she's the person who created the work and had no intention of creating a joint work. Taylor claiming that she's a joint author of the work because they created the work together and had the intention of combining it in the final project. And ultimately, the court comes down on Childress's side, finding that the initial credit of authorship to Childress, as well as the nature of the contributions in question, lead to the conclusion that Childress is the author of the work in question and that Taylor is not, primarily because Taylor, in the court's understanding, didn't contribute sufficient original elements to the work in order to be an author. That said, you know, maybe reflect on the nature of what Taylor contributed, and even if each individual element wasn't protectable, were they protectable in the aggregate? If they were protectable in the aggregate, were they an original element? And if they were an original element, was there agreement on the intention to produce a work in collaboration between Childress and Taylor? In other words, the court get it right here, it's a tough call, right? And the facts could come out either way. Okay. Erickson v. Trinity Theater, a lesser known case, but an interesting fact pattern. So Erickson essentially was a person who worked for Trinity Theater, employee of Trinity Theater, but she produced in the course of her employment a number of theatrical works on her own. Some of which are compilations of material from other sources. Most of them seem to be something along those lines, but that she kind of took bits and pieces from various places and combined them into theatrical productions, including one based on quotes from Shakespeare, one based on, you know, myths and whatnot from different cultures, and so on, and prepared them into theatrical productions with input from the actors from the theaters. But when her relationship with the theater ended and the theater kept producing the plays, she wasn't happy about it and claimed that she was the author and that they were not permitted to do that. And the theater's response was, well, sure, you were primarily responsible, but you created the plays in collaboration with the actors, and the actors also made contributions, and you agreed to their contributions. So if they made contributions, you agreed to the contributions, then that should be enough for them to be joint works and then them to be joint authors, right? So of course, joint authorship would mean people could, they could use the plays just as much as Erickson could, because they would be joint owners of the underlying work. And ultimately, in the Erickson case, the court found that the contributions of the authors were not sufficiently substantial to constitute original elements in some cases, and that as a general principle, there wasn't an agreement among the parties that, specifically Erickson and the actors, that they were joint authors for the purpose of the production of the play, and therefore these were not joint works, these were works owned entirely by Erickson. And there's a kind of analogy to an author and editor, for example, right, where the idea is, as soon as the author and then people make editorial suggestions, the fact you made editorial suggestions doesn't make you a joint author of the underlying work in question. That's certainly reflective of how we think about authorship in a kind of colloquial sense. Does it make sense in a technical sense about copyright ownership? And are those two ways of thinking about authorship properly sort of melded together or not? I think that's a tougher question, right? Is that the right way to think about authorship, or should we think about authorship in a more granular way and ask merely who's contributed copyrightable elements? Well, so in Gaiman v. McFarlane, we take another step even further, in which the court takes with a minority position in relation to the concept of joint authorship, but nonetheless an interesting one and one worth reflecting on, right? So what happened here? McFarlane, comic book artist, created a popular comic book series known as Spawn. Unfortunately, the initial run of Spawn was criticized for being poorly written. And so he brought on the well-known comic book writer, Neil Gaiman, to kind of help him jazz up the characters and make the series a little bit classier. And, classier, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, Neil Gaiman came on and helped come up with a bunch of additional dialogue and suggested some new kind of characters and plot elements that McFarlane incorporated into the series, namely medieval Spawn on the left, Angela, a kind of female hero character, and Count Cogliostro, who you see in the panel on the right. And so then the question became, to the extent that copyright can protect the characters, which we'll be talking about character protection more generally later in the class, are these the kind of characters that can be protected? And is there an element of joint authorship in the creation of the characters in question? And essentially, the defense from McFarlane was the elements contributed by Gaiman were just too general, right? I mean, the characters were kind of abstract. The elements contributed were abstract. And he says they were basically ideas. These are uncopyrightable elements that were contributed. Were they incorporated into the characters? Sure, right? But those uncopyrightable elements can't create joint authorship, because in order to be an author, you need to have contributed an original element to the work in question. And contributing an idea isn't contributing an original element. Therefore, if all you contribute is an idea, then you're not an author for the purpose of the Copyright Act. And the Seventh Circuit, in a somewhat controversial opinion by then Judge Posner, concluded that no, Gaiman could be an author, and it essentially jettisoned the idea that contributing an original element was necessary for joint authorship, and said that as long as the parties agree that joint authorship has occurred or manifest their agreement by virtue of their actions, then it is a jointly authored work, irrespective of the nature of the elements contributed by any of the parties. So under the circumstances, Gaiman, whether he contributed ideas or something more, could be a joint author of the characters in question, because the parties clearly agreed that this was going to be a collaboration in which the ultimate product was going to incorporate elements contributed by anyone involved, and therefore it didn't matter whether the particular elements contributed by Gaiman were copyrightable or not.